maybe 125 pounds, 130 pounds soaking wet. If he see any type of aggression or anything that you finna be a threat, he gonna take off on you first. You know what I mean? And he just, that's just what he was. I mean, and it's just show you how DNA is DNA and how they look for bloodlines when they breeding dogs. I hate to use that for as an example, looking for the bloodlines. Von wasn't around his dad that much. But when I tell you 100% his father, 100% his father, from sleeping in the car, from the ordering the food, from everything, the movements, the everything. So DNA is DNA. I mean.
How old were you when your parents separated?
They went together when I was born. My father was in jail. Then he passed away. I told him I had to get out. But my parents weren't really never together.
I see. Do you know what he went to jail for?
No, not exactly. Yeah, no.
He was in jail for a while?
Yeah, I met him when I was like 8, 7 or something. He was in jail all while. You see what I'm saying?
There was a step parent in your life?
Yeah.
How was your relationship?
Every legend has an origin story, but the story of King Von begins long before the world ever heard his name. It starts with a man whose reputation traveled through Chicago's South Side like a rumor that everyone believed, but few fully understood. A man Von barely knew growing up, yet someone whose life would shape the direction of his own. That man was his father, Walter Silk Bennett. For most of King Von's childhood, his father wasn't around. Silk spent much of Von's early years in and out of prison, caught in the cycle that many men in Chicago's street world couldn't escape. Because of that, Von didn't really know his father during the most important years of his childhood. Silk was more of a story people told him about than a consistent presence in his life. It wasn't until Von was about 8 years old that he finally started to build a real relationship with him. For the first time, the stories about Silk turned into actual memories. But just as that bond was beginning to form, tragedy would strike only a few years later. Silk would be killed, leaving behind a legacy that would haunt and influence his son for the rest of his life. To understand King Von's mentality, his rise from Chicago's streets, and the way his life unfolded, you first have to understand the man whose shadow he grew up under, the original king of the story. Walter Silk Bennett. Walter E. Bennett's life began with a story that sounds almost cinematic. According to people who knew the family, Silk wasn't born in a hospital like most children. His parents were already deeply involved in street conflicts at the time, and tensions with rivals were high. Hospitals were public places, and in their world that meant danger. They feared that enemies could show up at any moment. Because of that, Silk's parents made a decision that would later turn into legend. Instead of risking being in a hospital, they had him delivered at home. On October 28, 1974, a midwife helped bring him into the world in a house surrounded by family. The detail people remembered was what he was born on. Silk sheets. That moment would eventually inspire the nickname that followed him for the rest of his life. Whether every detail of the story stayed perfectly accurate over time didn't really matter. In Chicago neighborhoods where stories are passed down through generations, legends often grow alongside reality, and Silk's name would become one of those legends. He grew up in Ada Park on Chicago's South Side, an area that had a long history and a complicated future. The neighborhood was originally built for Black veterans returning home after World War II, designed to give families a place to rebuild their lives. It had parks, basketball courts, and community spaces filled with young people chasing different dreams. But like many neighborhoods in Chicago during the 80s and 90s, the streets around Ada Park slowly changed. Gang activity grew stronger, and the underground economy began shaping the daily life of the area. By the time Silk was growing up, Ada Park had already become known as a stronghold connected to the Black disciples. Silk was born directly into that environment. His father was known as a quiet but respected figure in the streets, someone who didn't speak often but commanded attention when he did. His mother had the opposite personality. She was outspoken, fiery, and protective of her family. Silk seemed to inherit traits from both of them. He carried himself calmly, but he had a bold presence that people noticed immediately. As a teenager, Silk stood out for more than just his personality. People who knew him during those years often say he was an extremely talented basketball player. Some even believed he could have had a real future in sports if he had taken that path seriously. But growing up in a neighborhood where the streets were always present made that decision difficult. The influence around him was powerful. One of the figures who reportedly played a role in shaping Silk's direction was a wealthy and respected street figure known as Big Reggie. Through the environment around him and the people he watched growing up, Silk slowly stepped deeper into the life that surrounded him. By the time he reached his late teenage years, his name was already starting to carry weight in Ada Park. During the early 1990s, Silk became known as one of the most influential figures connected to the Black disciples in his section of Chicago. He wasn't just another person in the streets. People described him as someone who knew how to organize and lead the people around him. His reputation wasn't built on reckless behavior. Instead, it came from the way he handled his crew and the loyalty he showed to those in his circle. One thing people consistently say about Silk is that he believed everybody around him should eat. If money was coming in, he made sure the people who stood with him were taken care of. That type of leadership created strong loyalty among the people close to him. Years later, King Von would show that same mindset when he reportedly shared large portions of his early rap earnings with his close friends and people from his neighborhood. The codes Silk lived by seemed to carry on through his son. Silk also had a personality that made him stand out. He loved cars and was known for pulling up in new vehicles that immediately grabbed attention. He carried himself with confidence and had a natural charisma that made people gravitate toward him. He was also known as a ladies' man, someone whose lifestyle matched the image people had of a rising street figure. Around 1993, Silk met a woman named Tasha. Not long after, their son was born on August 9, 1994. They named him Davon Daquan Bennett. The world would later know him as King Von. At the time, Silk was only 19 years old. His life in the streets meant legal trouble followed him often, and he spent large portions of Von's childhood incarcerated. Because of that, Von grew up primarily with his mother in Parkway Gardens on Chicago's South Side, the housing complex that would later become widely known as O Block. For most of Von's early years, Silk remained a distant figure in his life because of prison. That changed when Von was about 8 years old. Around that time, Silk was home long enough for father and son to finally start building a relationship. Those years were short, but they left a deep impression on Von. He looked up to his father and admired the reputation he had in the streets. Silk taught him about loyalty, about choosing who you keep around you, and about the realities of the environment they lived in. But that relationship would not last long. When someone builds the kind of reputation Silk had, enemies eventually come with it. Power, influence, and fear often create targets in the streets. On July 31st, 2005, just 9 days before King Von's 11th birthday, Walter Silk Bennett was killed. He was only 30 years old. The exact details surrounding his death have never been fully confirmed, and over the years, many different stories circulated about what really happened. But one of the most widely repeated accounts is that Silk was killed by a sniper. According to that version of events, a shooter positioned from a distance took a single calculated shot that struck Silk in the head. One bullet, one moment, and the man who had become a legend in Ada Park was gone. There were no clear answers about who carried out the attack. No widely known arrests followed. Instead, the streets filled with speculation, whispers, and theories about betrayal. For 10-year-old Davon Bennett, the loss was devastating. The father he had just begun to know had suddenly been taken away. The stories about Silk that once sounded larger than life now carried a different weight. Years later, Von would talk about how the death affected him, saying it stayed on his mind constantly after it happened. As Von grew older, the legend of his father continued to surround him. Friends, relatives, and people from the neighborhood all had their own stories about Silk. Over time, those stories began shaping how Von saw himself. Instead of running from that legacy, he embraced it. In his music later in life, Von even referenced Silk directly, acknowledging the connection he felt to the same path his father had walked. The similarities between them became hard to ignore. Both earned respect in the streets at young ages. Both built loyal circles around them. Both carried reputations that extended far beyond their immediate neighborhoods. Just like Silk had been a powerful figure in Ada Park, King Von eventually became one of the most recognized figures connected to O'Block. But the legacy Silk left behind wasn't only about respect and leadership. It also carried the violence that came with the life he had lived. After his father's death, Von became involved in street life at an early age. The anger, grief, and influence of the stories he grew up hearing shaped the mindset that would later define his music. When Von eventually entered the rap world, his storytelling felt different from many other artists. His songs sounded like raw accounts of the life he had experienced, told in a way that made listeners feel like they were hearing real stories rather than performances. That authenticity helped him rise quickly in Chicago's drill scene. In many ways, he had become a modern version of the legend he grew up hearing about. The most haunting part of the story is how closely their lives mirrored each other. Walter Silk Bennett built a reputation in the streets before his life was cut short at 30 years old. 15 years later, King Von was killed during a confrontation in Atlanta on November 6, 2020. He was only 26. 2 generations, 2 legends tied to the same environment, and 2 lives that ended in the same cycle of violence that surrounded them from the beginning. Silk may not have been present for most of King Von's childhood, but his influence still shaped the man his son would become. Even after his death, the legend of Walter Silk Bennett continued to live through the stories, the reputation, and eventually through the life of King Von himself.